It's been 20 years, and we know that people who participated in Tiananmen remain in prison, that their family members are harassed and discriminated against.
After the massacre, there was a most wanted list, and I was #1 on that list. So 1 month after the release of that list, I was arrested in Beijing. And 1 year later, I was sentenced for 4 years.
The legacy, I think, is particularly telling in the punitive and personal nature, especially when people try to publicly commemorate any aspect of the massacre. In early April, we saw an elderly professor who was trying to commemorate the death of one of the leaders who had tried to protect students, was severely beaten, a 75-year-old man, and that the government will go to the lengths to identify that person and publicly, physically beat them, I think is telling just how little has changed in China.
April and May of 1989 were some of the most exciting times ever in Chinese history. I was a young reporter at the time, and the feeling on the street, the fervor, the excitement about change were palpable. When we look back on it now, we forget the weeks and weeks of joy when Chinese citizens tasted political freedom for many of them the first time in their lives.
I think it's a very proud moment of the history of the Republic of China, because that was the first time people go to the street, speak up for themselves. So as a student, I think that also first time in my life to speak freely.
The student movement began as a movement for democracy. It was about political freedom. People understood that this was the moment, that suddenly the rules of the game were changing and that they could finally have their say.
It was a golden opportunity for both sides, I mean for society and for the state to cooperate to push more political reform.
What happened at Tiananmen was that all of the complaints that people had been prevented from expressing over decades of communist rule burst forward. And what began as a movement for democracy became really a movement for free expression that came close to toppling the Communist Party from power. Things grew more and more ominous in early June, and it was clear that the attack was being prepared. And the students felt it. There was an unease on the square and a sense of danger. And indeed it was on the night of June 3rd, the early morning hours of June 4th, that the Tiananmen Square protests were finally brought to a close, with the ugliest episode of bloody violence that the Communist Party had perpetrated in all its time in power. This was a peaceful political movement that was put down with violence. That was something that the whole world saw through the cameras that were trained on the tanks. There was, at the time, an absolutely unashamed, unembarrassed denial on the part of anyone in authority that anything had ever happened at all.
After Tiananmen massacre, Chinese government just cracked down any potential protest, any potential of opposition movement, and they also block any access to information about the truth. So the whole social atmosphere changed dramatically, and the young generation know almost nothing about what happened in 1989 and what happened in the years before 1989.
The Chinese government has been incredibly successful at expunging any record of those events and making it politically untenable for people outside the country to even raise Tiananmen. And that kind of willingness to forget of the outside world makes it easier for the Chinese government to systematically abuse people's rights whenever it is politically convenient to do so, and know that there aren't consequences.
Tiananmen taught the Chinese government that freedom of speech is the core issue that they must control.
Domestic press censorship in China doesn't just have consequences for people inside China. Because the domestic Chinese press couldn't write about SARS or melamine scandals or lead-painted toys, we wind up with global public health problems, product safety problems. This matters for everyone everywhere now. Human Rights Watch has acknowledged some of the progress inside China, including writing the state's obligation to protect and promote human rights into the Constitution. We've seen some progress with respect to the treatment of the foreign press, with some labor issues. But the reality is that this remains a country in which you are not permitted to publicly criticize the government without fear of real reprisals. Everybody wants China to be a better economic partner, a better security partner, a better diplomatic partner. But that's not going to happen until we see the right to freedom of expression really respected, until we see due process and an independent legal system, and until we see the right to peaceful dissent. Until China embraces those principles, most countries' foreign policy aims with respect to China will remain unfulfilled and unfulfillable.